A rabbit has a ridiculous biological advantage. It grows quickly, it reproduces quickly, it needs relatively little space. And unlike cattle, you don't need a huge pasture just to keep one alive. On paper, rabbits look almost perfectly designed for turning plants into protein. So why don't you see rabbit meat everywhere? Why isn't it sitting beside chicken, beef, and pork in every American supermarket? And more importantly, why does eating a rabbit feel strange to so many people? Because the answer has almost nothing to do with the rabbit. It has to do with what humans decided a rabbit was. Let's start with the biology. A rabbit's pregnancy lasts only about a month. A healthy female can produce several young in a litter, and those young grow surprisingly quickly. That creates an extraordinary reproductive cycle. Compare that with cattle. A cow carries one calf for roughly 9 months, and raising that calf to market weight takes far longer. A rabbit can go from birth to a usable animal in a fraction of the time. That doesn't automatically make rabbit the perfect meat animal. Real farming has disease, feed costs, mortality, labor, and breeding limits. But biologically, rabbits are extremely productive. They're also relatively small. That matters. A farmer doesn't need enormous grazing land for a rabbit colony. They can be kept in comparatively small spaces, and historically, families have even raised them around their homes. And there's another advantage. Rabbit meat is very lean. It contains a lot of protein while generally being much lower in fat than many conventional meats. So from the perspective of someone looking for a small, fast-growing source of animal protein, rabbit looks pretty impressive. And humans actually knew this long before modern sustainability became a buzzword. During the Second World War, meat was difficult to obtain in many places. Beef and pork were restricted by rationing. Families were encouraged to find alternatives, and rabbits became one of them. In Britain especially, rabbit became a familiar source of meat. People raised rabbits. People cooked rabbits. People ate rabbits. It wasn't considered exotic. It was simply food. For a while, the idea that Americans and Britons would eventually stop eating rabbits would have sounded strange. But then the war ended, and the rabbit's position in society began to change. The first major shift wasn't happening in the kitchen. It was happening in people's homes. Rabbits increasingly became pets. That sounds harmless, but culturally, it changes everything. Because once an animal moves from the backyard cage to the child's bedroom, it stops being just livestock. It becomes a companion, and popular culture accelerated that transformation. Children grew up with rabbits in stories. Peter Rabbit, Bugs Bunny, Thumper. These weren't animals people were supposed to imagine as dinner. They were characters. They had personalities. They were funny. They were clever. They were sometimes practically members of the family. And this creates a strange psychological boundary. Humans don't have a universal list of animals that are objectively food. Different cultures eat completely different animals. One country might consider something perfectly normal to eat, while another country finds the idea horrifying. The boundary is cultural. We learn which animals belong on plates, and which animals belong beside us. Think about dogs. In much of the Western world, eating a dog sounds unthinkable. But biologically, there's nothing magical about a dog that makes it fundamentally different from a pig or a cow. The difference is cultural meaning, and rabbits gradually crossed that same invisible line. They became cute. They became pets. They became childhood characters. And once that happened, putting one on a plate became emotionally uncomfortable. But there's another piece of the puzzle. Chicken. Because chicken didn't simply become America's favorite meat because people liked the taste. Chicken was incredibly convenient for industrial agriculture. They're relatively small. They grow quickly. Large numbers can be raised together, and their bodies can be processed efficiently using highly standardized systems. Once the industry began scaling up, everything reinforced everything else. More chickens meant cheaper chicken. Cheaper chicken meant more consumers. More consumers justified bigger factories. Bigger factories lowered costs even further. And eventually, an entire food system grew around chicken. Feed companies, breeding programs, processing plants, supermarkets, fast food restaurants, advertising, supply chains. Rabbit never received that same industrial machine. And this is where biology meets economics. A rabbit can be extremely efficient at converting feed into meat, while still being inconvenient to process on a massive factory line. The animal is small. Its carcass is different. Its bones and body shape don't fit perfectly into systems designed around chickens or larger livestock. And when an industry has already invested billions into one animal, more efficient in some biological category isn't enough to replace it. The infrastructure itself becomes an advantage. But rabbit's decline wasn't caused by economics alone. Disease also played a major role in its history. In the 20th century, a devastating rabbit disease called myxomatosis spread through rabbit populations in Europe. The disease was particularly destructive to wild rabbits, and the public saw something horrifying. Rabbits weren't simply disappearing. People were seeing sick, suffering animals. That changed the emotional image surrounding them. An animal that had once been associated with food food, farming, and ordinary life was increasingly associated with suffering. But even after the worst outbreaks passed, rabbit meat didn't return to its old position. And that's important because it tells us the story wasn't just about disease. It was about memory. The culture had changed. The rabbit had become something different in people's minds. And this is why the global picture is so revealing. Because saying humans don't eat rabbit is simply not true. Millions of people around the world do. Rabbit appears in traditional dishes across Europe. France has a long history of rabbit cuisine. Italy and Spain have regional rabbit dishes. China has a major rabbit meat industry. In other parts of the world, eating rabbit isn't remotely controversial. So there isn't anything universally disgusting about rabbit meat. The resistance is concentrated in particular cultures, especially in places where rabbits became strongly associated with pets and childhood entertainment. And that tells us something fascinating about human food. Our diets aren't determined by efficiency alone. If they were, every country would eventually converge on exactly the same animals. But that doesn't happen. We inherit food traditions. We inherit emotional associations. We inherit ideas about what is normal. And sometimes those decisions are surprisingly arbitrary. A cow can be intelligent. A pig can be affectionate. A chicken can be surprisingly clever. A rabbit can be raised for food. But culture decides where each animal belongs. And once that decision becomes normal, it becomes incredibly difficult to reverse. That's why attempts to bring rabbit back haven't completely changed the picture. Chefs have promoted it as lean meat. Food writers have called it sustainable. Restaurants have presented it as a premium ingredient. But telling someone that an animal is environmentally efficient doesn't automatically erase decades of emotional conditioning. If you grew up seeing a rabbit as a cartoon character or as the animal sitting in your backyard, your brain may never completely categorize it the same way it categorizes a chicken. And that's the strange conclusion. Rabbit didn't fail because it was biologically useless. It didn't disappear because humans suddenly discovered it was unhealthy. And it wasn't simply defeated by another animal. Rabbit lost a cultural competition. Chicken became an industry. Rabbits became companions. And history pushed those two animals onto completely different sides of the dinner table. The rabbit itself never changed. Its biology didn't suddenly become inefficient. Its ability to reproduce didn't disappear. Its meat didn't transform into something nutritionally useless. What changed was the meaning humans attached to it. And maybe that's the most interesting part of the story. Because if our food choices can change because of cartoons, childhood memories, disease outbreaks, economics, and industrial infrastructure, then the question isn't really, why don't we eat rabbits? It's, how many of the animals we call food were simply lucky enough to end up on the correct side of the cultural line? And if that line can move once, there's no reason it couldn't move again. Because sometimes the strangest thing about what humans eat isn't the animal, it's us.